Now go! Let the legend come back to life.
Did you like it?
In 2015, one of the most beloved games in the Metal Gear franchise, the Phantom Pain, had arrived. With a game that I like to call the flawed masterpiece, because everything that was in the game that made it so great still stays up today as still being one of the most fun and enjoyable experiences to play. Because for the first time ever, we was to play Metal Gear Solid in an open world environment with unquestionably the best controls in the entire franchise that made it so smooth and easy to play. But there's no doubt Metal Gear Solid 5 has a lot of flaws, and some that are worth pointing out. For those who played the previous titles will understand what I'm talking about. Because Metal Gear 5, which was to improve on a lot of things from the previous titles, it also failed to recapture what it is we loved from the originals to begin with. If we take it back to E3 2013, this is where we got a good glimpse into what it is we was in for, with Metal Gear Solid 5 seeming to be open world. The fact that we could utilize different ways of stealth by using our environment, such as using our horse, and other ways of getting around. And just like you guys, I had many ideas for the possibilities that we was in for in this game. Given on that most of the other titles beforehand have never really let us down, this game seemed to be like it was going to be the best Metal Gear of all time. To me, it felt like some of the trailers were slightly misleading, as there were certain cutscenes from within the trailers that didn't eventually make it into the game. But at the time, none of us were aware of the rift that was between Kojima and Konami as a whole that would cause this game to become the flawed masterpiece. With the time constraints and the budgeting problems and creative differences, not to mention at the time this was running on the PlayStation 3 hardware. It's not that Metal Gear Solid 5 doesn't go down as being one of the good ones, it just doesn't come down to being as good as most of the others in the franchise. For me, my expectations were quite high for this game, knowing on the legacy that it has. Not to say that I was disappointed with the outcome, it still is one of the best games I played, and I'll always love it, but at the same time, we need to address the problems that it had. In MGS5, we had so much more creative experience, unlike any other game. But it just felt like the world, as big as it was, we just found ourselves doing side missions that seemed highly repetitive, such as extract the prisoner, or rescue the high-ranked soldier, or destroy the armored units. It just got very repetitive over time, and considering how big and beautiful the map was, it just felt like when you're roaming around, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot going on. Certain sections within the Phantom Pain where you find yourself either in a vehicle or a horse trying to get around, and for miles upon miles you're finding nothing of interest. Whilst I'm really happy they added the open world feature in, I think the game would have been better off having a more direct narrative in terms of its map direction like the previous titles than the ones we had here. I believe the game should have drawn some inspiration from other great open world titles such as Far Cry and GTA in terms of how we can interact with the world, and quite honestly I was disappointed with the whole combat deployment situation, as we're meant to be a private military organization unit, and it would have been nice to be able to utilize that out there in the open world experience. For example, the Mujahideen at that time when we were fighting against the Russians, there could have been many simulated battles that were taking place in which way we could recruit other soldiers through other methods than just the Fulton extraction. For example, in Metal Gear Solid 4, when you can actually evade the rebels or help them, and in exchange they can help you and let you get past to do your mission. Even though we did get to use the helicopter support and inbound for supplies and bombardment in situations, it could have just been way more capitalized on. For example, in Far Cry, when you can take over certain towns and villages, it would have been cool to see Diamond Dogs giving assistance to the Mujahideen, giving you more of an incentive to return back to the open world once you receive an alert that perhaps one of the bases under attack or the villages with villagers are in there are needing your assistance. Even playing into the demon score ability where if you wanted to, you could attack the villagers in exchange for the resources, but it affects your heroism negatively unless you actually help this villagers survive. Whilst I can't really complain with the end result of what we had, because Metal Gear was open world for the first time, I'll take it, it was great, but it just could have been more improved on to make it more lively and have replayability. I think personally the game should have stayed more in a sandbox environment just because of the fact that it was a big open world with not really much else to do there. It would have been a really cool feature to see that we could have used our actual combat unit to come down like a squadron and rappel down from helicopters to give us assistance in battle situations too. Maybe like a full-on military scale war that we could have actually seen in the combat deployment section for its own separate thing. With Far Cry style liberating of the outposts, or the likes of GTA's ability to bump into certain strangers and incidences that take place. So whilst I'm glad they added the open world feature in, it would have just been way more better if we had so much more to do. Leave me a comment and let me know what you think should have been improved on the open world, or if you were happy with what you had. For anyone who is a true Metal Gear Solid fan, loves it for its story, because the plot lines and twists and turns within Hideo Kojima's writing has changed the game in what it is to capture an audience, to be intrigued to find out more in this mind-boggling franchise that seems to ask more questions than it gives us answers. I swear you can play this game for years and still come back and play it and realize that there's certain things that you may have not remembered, because quite rightly this game is massively in-depth, with so much more that you find yourself learning coming back after all these years. Phantom Pain is no exception, and probably by far the most mind-boggling twist we've ever had within gaming history. Who can deny the continuation from Ground Zeroes to Phantom Pain's cinematic and horrific opening within the hospital segment? From old and familiar faces we remember from the previous franchise that might have loved these games to begin with, is now being implemented in a way that is so cinematically well done. You don't need me to tell you how great this game is. But once again we come across a major flaw, which is the most important element within Metal Gear Solid, its story. Chapter 1 was almost absolutely exceptional, with not one problem, aside from the part where Skullface and Snake meet each other. The entire build up to this moment would be the disappointment that everyone is completely aware of. Sadly, it felt underwhelming, and the music like it didn't belong within this scene. Music is a big thing when it comes to Metal Gear. I just felt like they had the placement wrong. For such a song should have been in a scene like this. The moment between Skullface and Venom in the car just seems very contradictory of the past history that would make the combat situation very high. And the whole point and meaning of building this army, Diamond Dogs, was to put an end to XOF along with Skullface. Especially given on the fact that Skullface is aware that Big Boss is to try and stop him fulfilling his plans. He could have just had him killed there and then. Whilst I think the stealthy approach in OKB-0 was a fantastic idea, personally I think the story would have worked better if that was the case, where Snake was trying to take out Skullface on the quiet, but ends up getting captured, and therefore that ensues the whole battle between Diamond Dogs and XOF, with Snake breaking free from the clutches and having his own personal fight with Skullface. Whilst once again I'm happy with the story we got given, with all the intentions of revenge, metaphorically I think this moment was meant to make us feel as empty, as Skullface was in a position of weakness. And as the saying goes, what goes around comes around, as it was the case for Big Boss and Miller all them years ago with the surprise attack, only Skullface now being in the same position. My interpretation of this moment here is how Kojima had placed the scene purposely, to show the emptiness and the feelings of revenge really make you feel. Hideo Kojima is the master of using subliminal hidden messages that one has to figure out, such as the Friedrich Nietzsche quote, "There are no facts, only interpretations," which is the case for a lot of this story in Phantom Pain, which seems like a lot of what we see may just be one big interpretation of how the viewer sees things. With chapter 1 looking quite smooth, we get a great ending to what seems like to end the perfect chapter. It's more or less when we start heading towards the second chapter of the game, where we find ourselves repeating the same missions we've already just done before, and we really start to get this sense of feeling that we're not going to be able to play into anything that's going to open up the story just that little bit more. Whilst we had an appearance from the real Big Boss at the end of MGS5, it would have been nice to see an expansion on the Outer Heaven story. It just seemed very lackluster at best. It was lacking what it needed to drive the story forward. Whilst we did get to have the content with Quiet during the Quiet exit, that in itself wasn't enough to really expand on the story to give the game its full circle that we all expected to have. Personally, I think at the end of Chapter 1, that's when Snake should have had his identity revealed to him. So from there on, as the second chapter progressed, we could understand how he dealt with this dissociation of his character. Maybe saw a more darker side start approach to him by him doing certain things that would develop his character for why we could understand his turn and evil demise in Metal Gear. Whilst we did get a hint of Solid Snake's arrival during Operation Intrude as Venom Snake places the tape within the MSX, it was a nice little nod, but I'm sure many agree it would have been a lot better to see at least a silhouette or some appearance of Snake. Ironically, the game's called The Phantom Pain, and that's exactly what we're all going through now because it feels like we've lost something that's still there, as we still keep revisiting this game and for turn after turn, trying to figure out what could have been. But in reality, it's what is done is done. But with the good news of MGSV Delta's return, there could be a possibility of an expansion onto this story. So aside from the Mission 51 with Eli and Psycho Mantis and the missing Battle Gear content along with other things such as Chico, we'll never really truly know how this game could have fully have been at its best. While Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain game neared universal acclaim for its gameplay, ardent Metal Gear fans, myself included, were disappointed by a polarizing conclusion, and the lack of both coherent story arc and the connective tissue that was expected to tie the modern Metal Gear series into Metal Gear games of the MSX. I think it's also worth giving a mention to this commenter who mentioned that Metal Gear Solid would have been so much more better if these tapes were made mandatory. In fact, maybe just like the codec calls, so people could have a good understanding of what's going on in the game. Because there's so many times where you just really don't know what it is you're doing and what the main story is. It's sad to see the relationship between Kojima and Konami had to fall apart, and the majority of the content that could have been put into codec calls or perhaps cutscenes was all put into tapes. It's worth mentioning too when you do hit the codec call button that it's all just the same repeated garbage from before, whereas on the old Metal Gear games, you'd always get a unique codec call regarding the situation you found yourself in. There is great protagonists in Metal Gear Solid 5, but the one thing it does lack is great antagonists, and along with many boss fights that we're used to seeing in the previous titles. And sure, whilst we had the iconic sniper duel with Quiet and the little mother base fight with Eli and then the eventual fight with Philanthropist, it's nothing in comparison from the rest of the Metal Gear games where we had a good selection of bosses to fight from. But to be completely honest with you, even though it lacked most of these charming qualities, there was still something massively alluring about Metal Gear Solid 5, aside from its ambience and the fantastic cutscenes along with the amazing voice acting that goes into these characters. But according to reports and Hideo Kojima himself along with his fellow executives, there was a reason behind why the story felt like a blank space.
And quote, in MGS5 we hand the story, the legend, over to the player. That's how the player becomes the big boss in the MSX2, Metal Gear. You play the game as you will raise up your mother base. That's the way I want the player to create his own story, thinking of things like war and peace. As Big Boss up until now, the Metal Gear saga was told by creating video games, but I want each player to think and come up with their own story, legend on their own. End quote. Quote, there is a blank space, but it will not be filled in that blank space. There is always a hero because there is a blank space. You can advance ahead. It is the blank space exactly. That is the end quote. Even the position of the novelization, written by author Hideo Kojima, as canon is a void, with a typically cryptic Hideo Kojima adding, quote, language remains even if existence vanishes, unquote.
This is pretty much a confirmed summary for what Hideo Kojima intended for us to perceive. By not just looking at the story for what it is in a canon sense, but to also have our own intake of what we believe how the events took place for our own reasons. Many people might not have understood the intentions behind Hideo Kojima's message, but I think it serves very well, considering that this was going to be the last Metal Gear that he was to work on, and to give us a final goodbye as the fans. I think within the blank space as well, is to fill it with the word acceptance. To accept the fact with what the Phantom Pain gave us, and what it left us. And for how we can move on now and see to the future that there potentially might be the finishing touches to the original Metal Gear games that Konami may deliver in the future, if it turns out that Delta is a success. Well anyway guys, this is all for the video. I hope you like it. Leave me a comment. This has been the Voice Box, and I'll see you soon.